Hello and welcome to this introductory episode of Law for Lawmakers. I'm Fiona Rutherford, Chief Executive of Justice. We're a law reform and human rights charity working to create a fair and effective justice system within everyone's reach. This podcast is based on our Law for Lawmakers guide, and the guide is designed to help repair the cracks in the UK's political foundations by giving every MP the tools that they need to act as custodians of our democracy. It explains the key legal and constitutional principles that underpin good lawmaking, helping parliamentarians and their staff review laws, table and write amendments to bills, support their constituents, and hold power to account. But this podcast isn't just for parliamentarians. It's for anyone who cares about how laws are made, how rights are protected, and how our democratic institutions function. Each episode brings together leading voices from law, politics and public life to explore the legal principles that shape our society and to demystify the role of Parliament and the role it plays in upholding those principles. In this pilot episode, we're introducing the guide itself, why we created it, what it covers, and how it can both support new and seasoned parliamentarians in their work. I'm joined by two of the people who led the development of this edition of the guide. Steph Needleman is Justice's Legal Director. She oversees our legal and policy work, leading our efforts to strengthen the rule of law, access to justice and fairness of the UK's justice system. Tyrone Steele is our Interim Director of Strategy, Impact and Development, and is responsible for shaping our strategic direction and ensuring that our work is impactful, supporting meaningful evidence-led reform. Steph, Tyrone, welcome. It's great to have you here. So what is Law for Lawmakers and why should both parliamentarians and the wider public care about it? Steph?
So MPs play two really vital roles as lawmakers, legislators, and also as constituency MPs, so helping deal with issues that their constituents come across. And the guide basically provides MPs with advice and information that they need to perform both of these roles properly and in accordance with the rule of law. So it talks both about the legislative process, things to look out for as an MP scrutinising a piece of legislation, but also about how MPs can help their constituents, where they can point them for information on legal issues, etc., that they might come across. Obviously, the way laws are made in this country and what the outcome of the lawmaking process is crucial to the public. It is ultimately the public who is going to be guided, whose lives are affected every day by the laws that are made in Parliament.
Tyrone, building on that point about the public, why should the public care about this, or certainly non-parliamentarians care about this guide? Why is it useful to them?
Well, I think Seth made a really important point there in terms of the quality of lawmaking and the quality of legislation. Now, one of the reasons why we set up this guide in the first place was the fact that MPs and peers aren't actually provided that much training in terms of how the law works, how the legal system works, and fundamentally we have to remember lawmakers are developing the legal system. So having a good understanding of how that works is in their interests to make sure that they can do their jobs as effectively as they possibly can. I think at the same time, Fiona, you raised the point in terms of members of the public. I think members of the public, when they're thinking about the NHS or they're thinking about housing law, like the Renters' Rights Bill, which we've worked on, they should be able to expect from their lawmakers a level of knowledge and understanding so they can make sure those laws are as impactful and effective as possible. And I think that's really, really fundamental to making sure that we have a system that works and serves everyone, wherever they live in the country.
Yeah, just to pick up on that point, ultimately it's the public who have to be able to structure their lives and they are living in accordance with the laws of the country so that they understand what their rights are, etc. So it's really vital that legislation that comes out of Parliament is clear about those things so that the public can understand what they're required to do and what rights, entitlements, etc. they have under the law.
I mean, protesters is a good example of that stuff, isn't it? I mean, thinking about, we've just published a report on protest rights, and at the moment, we've seen through our work together the fact that protest law has become incredibly complicated. So if you're a member of the public who wants to go out and exercise, their rights to protest, or you're a police officer, at the moment that's really unclear. And so we're hoping that through this guide, MPs, when they're looking at new pieces of legislation which touch areas like protest, they'll hopefully be able to get it a little bit better next time.
And we talk about the rule of law, and the principles behind it are set out carefully in the guide. But really, the rule of law is about everyday legal problems. You've just touched on some of those areas when you were mentioning housing, but benefits, schooling, immigration. There's a whole range of different parts of our daily lives that are touched by the rule of law. How can this guide help MPs and caseworkers and others interested in how legislation is made spot the right issues early and get the right support that they need?
Well, you've raised a number of those issues. Whenever we, in terms of immigration, housing, etc. So part of the way that we made this guide, we didn't just come up with it by ourselves. We spoke to the people who we wanted to use it. We spoke to MPs and we spoke to caseworkers and tried to get a sense from them. What are the top issues that come across their desk day to day? What are constituents really asking them for? And so that's one of the motivations. One of the ways that we structured the guide was to give them a high level understanding of how those areas work, so they're best able to serve their constituents on those issues.
Yeah, and just a little plug for Chapter 7 of the guide, where there's a whole list of helpful resources for MPs and their caseworkers in the constituency to help them with that signposting task that they so often do when constituents come to them looking for advice, because they obviously aren't necessarily lawyers themselves and can't advise clients on areas of law themselves.
So when a new law is going through Parliament, what are the red flags that MPs and the public should look out for?
One of the biggest red flags would probably be, thinking about what's the law actually trying to achieve, what's it trying to do, and what powers is it giving the government. And something that we've seen come up time and time again, this is a theme that we've talked about we did a report in 2023 looking at threats and challenges to the rule of law. We've just published a follow-up one looking at building resilience through culture and practice. And a common theme that we see through our work scrutinising legislation is often the government finds it quite convenient to give itself really broad powers. So they'll say, okay, Parliament, we want to achieve this general aim, but we haven't quite decided how we want to do that at this moment. So give us carte blanche, give us a blank checkbook to do what we want to do later down the line. That's obviously, a red flag. It's obviously unsatisfactory, because does Parliament really know how those powers are going to be used in that particular moment or by a future government of whatever colour? One of the things that we're quite keen on making sure that Parliament does when it scrutinises legislation is really get into the nitty-gritty of what's the purpose for this legislation, what's the government trying to achieve, and what are the safeguards to make sure it stays on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, I mean, a failure to do that basically usurps the role of Parliament. Parliament's role is to scrutinise legislation and the policy contained within it. And if there is no policy, or the powers are so broad it's unclear how they're going to be used, then it's not possible for Parliament to perform the function that it is there to perform. I mean, I think linked to that, there's a lot of issues about things called Henry VIII clauses, where basically a bill will give ministers the power to amend primary legislation at a future date through secondary legislation, which is subject to far less scrutiny by Parliament than a piece of primary legislation. So again, that's just another example of ways in which Parliament's role can be undermined. Also, just to come back to this point about the public needing ultimately to shape their lives in accordance with these laws, I mean, first and foremost, I think you need to look to see if the law is clear and understandable. And that would be the sort of first thing on the list. So sort of overly convoluted and complex drafting and outcomes. The immigration rules being a famous example of those, are a red flag, I think. I guess one other thing to mention is ouster clauses. So these are clauses where basically the ability for the court to scrutinise decisions and functions of the executive, so the government of the day, is removed by the legislation. Obviously, courts are a check on government power, so we want to be really careful about removing that really crucial check on government power.
And thinking about the complexities that sometimes exist, you've given the example of immigration laws being a good example of that. If an MP or an advisor encounters a complex legal issue, where should they turn to first? And equally, where can members of the public find reliable, accessible legal help?
I mean, I think I'd first do a plug to justice in that regards. Might be surprised to say, but we're quite used to working with parliamentarians across the board to help them understand some of these tricky issues. At the same time, and this is one of the motivations for the guide, we want to empower parliamentarians and their staff to be able to do this themselves, so that they're able to make sure that they are given the tools that they need, that they have, Stephanie mentioned, I think, the checklist that we've got in the guide as well, that sets out some things they might want to think about when they're doing that scrutinising exercise. There's plenty of people in the NGO space, people like Justice, organisations like Justice, but ultimately, if parliamentarians don't have that first sense themselves, then I think the system will be all the weaker.
Anything to add to that, Steph?
Not much, right? I mean, maybe just thinking again about, in terms of, you've spoken a lot, Tyrone, about where MPs can turn and thinking about the public. Obviously, we've seen increasingly, because of cuts to legal aid and a lack of access to free legal advice, that increasingly members of the public are turning to their MPs as a first port of call, whereas previously they might have gone to see a lawyer to deal with their issues. So it is really important, increasingly important, for MPs to have a really good sense of what constitutes a legal issue and where they can signpost their constituents to. And there are lots of good free legal resources out there that are listed in the Law for Lawmakers guide as well.
Excellent. So what habit would you love every parliamentarian to adopt to better protect the rule of law? And how can the public hold them to it?
I would like them to talk more about the rule of law and what it means to individual people. I think there's this idea of the rule of law as some grand constitutional idea, but that is not how people experience it. As I think we've sort of all mentioned frequently, people experience it in their day-to-day, in the ability to resolve housing disputes, in whether they are accused of a crime and how a criminal process might happen. And I think unless MPs talk about the rule of law and connect it to those everyday issues, people won't understand and value the rule of law, and that's when you start getting into trouble about maintaining adherence and the UK's pretty good record in terms of upholding the rule of law.
You mentioned crime, Tyrone. Maybe talk through a little bit of the work that we're doing in relation to criminal and why the criminal justice system and why the rule of law is particularly important.
The whole criminal policy space is full of examples of how some of the principles that we talk about in the guide maybe haven't been applied in practice. I mean, one that's in the news a lot at the moment is the prisons crisis, the prisons overcrowding crisis, and that's operating hand in hand with the courts backlog. So, the criminal courts aren't able to handle all of the cases that are going before them, and our prisons are too full. Now, for anyone working in this policy space, this isn't new. This has been a slow-moving car crash that has been accelerating in recent years. More than a decade ago, if you spoke to anyone in the space, they could see this coming. But why didn't our politicians? Why were they not able to scrutinise those policies that have led us into this situation and have resulted in the need, certainly the prison space, for some quite radical reforms which the government have brought forward? So some of the work that we've been doing in that space, we had a report come out recently on the probation system. We had a report coming out on the prison system and decision-making within prisons. Looking further forward, we've got a big programme of work coming out on juries, which fits into the court's backlog situation. Now, the government says, although it's not able to point to any evidence, that removing juries is necessary for that. Our role is that actually there's other places that you should be focusing on, like infrastructure, like investment, like procedures, which would make sure that we're able to safeguard that really, really precious right.
Am I allowed another one?
Go on.
Tyrone, you prompted me to think about it. The other thing I would like, because this comes up time and time again, is for politicians and MPs not to think that AI is a magic wand. Yeah. And we are I'm all in favour of using AI where it will be genuinely helpful and the right protections and safeguards can be put in place, but that it needs to be used to ensure that the rule of law is maintained and upheld, and it's not necessarily a magic wand to fix everything.
A valuable additional note there. So finally, I'm going to bring this to a close by asking something a bit more personal about both of you, although related to the rule of law, and ask what brought you both to work for an organisation that works hard to promote and protect the rule of law?
It's a big question. I think we were talking about definitions of the rule of law earlier, and often in academic and legal circles you get these discussions about a thick rule of law and a thin rule of law. I think you can boil it down really to the principle of fairness, and I think that's something that everyone across the country understands. They recognise when rights are being infringed. They recognise when you have one rule for someone else and another rule for another. And so for me personally, one of the things I really enjoy working about justice is that in all of the work that I'm doing, that's a kind of motivating factor I see across the whole team, that we're trying to build a system that is fairer, that is more accessible. And I think that's something that the public can be proud of. The public have great affection for the NHS, for example. It's a key British institution. I think as we're seeing the criminal justice system in particular, and other parts of the justice system generally declining, people are noticing those gaps, and I think we're at a really, really good opportunity to try and reverse some of those trends.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I agree in terms of like that sense of fairness, which I've always felt quite strongly. It's really motivated me to work for an organisation like Justice, and I think it's about like the fairness of power, like power being exercised fairly. I grew up in a Jewish family. My grandparents both fled Poland at the start of the war, and so I've always been surrounded by that history very deeply, and it's the ultimate example of where you move from the rule of law to the rule by law, and law being used as a tool of oppression, in the most extreme way. And you need the rule of law to prevent that happening at its most extreme, and that is why I think I care so passionately for it.
Thank you both for joining me today to discuss the guide and how it came to be. And thank you to all of those who tuned in to listen to Law for Lawmakers. We designed this guide not just for parliamentarians, but for anyone who cares about the rule of law, whatever your background. To learn more about our work and to access the guide, visit www.justice.org.uk. And if you found this episode insightful, like, subscribe, share with colleagues, family, friends, and anybody who really cares about the rule of law and democracy. I look forward to speaking to you on the next episode.